You don't hear the number first. You hear the silence. It's 8:01 p.m. on the 1st of December, 1969. The air in your parents' living room is stale with anticipation and uneaten meatloaf. The television hums, bathing everything in grainy grayscale. Your dad's leg won't stop shaking. Your mother's hands are wrung dry. You sit between them on the couch like a deer between headlights, pretending not to care. They're pulling birthdays out of a glass jar, one by one. Your country has invented a game show where the prize is death. You're 19, you've got pimples on your back and a secret stash of weed in your sock drawer. You go to community college when you feel like it, flip burgers 3 nights a week, and still feel guilty for stealing that Playboy in 7th grade. You think about sex more than sleep. You hate your stepdad's taste in music, and you don't know how to fix a flat tire. You were supposed to have time. Instead, your birthday floats out of the jar like a ghost. The 24th of April, draft number 17. There's a pause. Your mother makes a sound like she's been punched in the gut. Your dad says nothing, just leans back in his recliner and takes a sip of bourbon that suddenly tastes like acid. You stare at the screen. Your name isn't on it, but your sentence is. You're in the post office. Line of silent boys, dead eyes, draft notices in hand. No music, no laughter, just the quiet shuffling of feet trying not to exist. Your letter came the next day. Cream-colored envelope with your name in blocky, impersonal font. Inside, a note that politely informs you that you are now property of the United States government. That your life is no longer your own. That liberty and freedom, those things you're apparently going to fight for, no longer apply to you. Your friends joke about fleeing to Canada. You laugh too hard and too loud, but you won't go. You can't. Your dad fought in Korea. Your uncle in World War II. There's a weird, shapeless guilt when you think about running. You'd rather die than disappoint your father. Fortunately, you might get both. You keep thinking, maybe it'll end before I get there. Maybe Nixon will pull out. Maybe I'll flunk the physical. Maybe. But your body works. Your teeth are fine. Your lungs, despite the pot, still pass the tests. Congratulations. You're healthy enough to kill strangers in the jungle. Your girlfriend doesn't cry when you tell her. She just stops blinking for a long time, then says, "Oh." She tries to be supportive. She starts writing you letters before you've even left. You'll stop hearing from her 3 months into the war. You don't know that yet. You spend the days before you leave, like someone on death row. You go to the lake. You try to memorize the way the sun feels on your skin. You eat 5 cheeseburgers in one sitting because you heard the rations are crap. You tell your mom you love her every day. You get drunk. You get drunk again. You get in a bar fight with some college kid who says the war is imperialist bullshit. You punch him in the mouth and feel sick afterward. You tell yourself you're doing your duty. You're not really sure what that means, but it sounds noble. You need something to sound noble. You say goodbye. You pack a bag. You ride a Greyhound to the induction center. You sit in another line. You get a buzz cut. You take off your clothes and stand naked next to 100 other boys who look just as scared as you. You sign your life away. You are now private nobody. You never forget the first bus ride to basic training. They cram you into a hot metal can with no air conditioning and no mercy. The guy next to you smells like sour milk. Someone behind you is crying quietly. Someone in the back starts singing, "Leaving on a jet plane," and half the bus joins in, not because they want to sing, but because there's nothing else to do. The guy across the aisle throws up into a paper bag. Outside, America passes by in slow, oblivious motion. Gas stations, cornfields, malls. People pumping gas, mowing lawns, eating fast food. They're living their lives. You're going to learn how to end them. Welcome to Fort Polk, Louisiana, nicknamed Tigerland. More like Mosquitoland. The air smells like mold and diesel fuel. The sergeant who greets you has a voice like a broken chainsaw and a nose that's been broken twice. He looks at you like you're already dead. He doesn't even bother learning your name. You're just dumbass now. The first week, they tear you apart. You run until your knees feel like gravel. You crawl through mud so thick, it gets inside your eyelids. You wake up at 4 a.m. to screams and whistles and the blaring of some god-awful trumpet. You get pushed, punched, screamed at. You hold a rifle for the first time. It's heavier than it looks. You wonder if it will like you. They tell you this is how they make a soldier. You wonder what they're destroying in the process. You meet other draftees. Some are loud, some are terrified. One guy prays every night. One guy never sleeps. One guy jokes constantly, like his life depends on it. Maybe it does. You share cigarettes and trauma. You bond over blisters and bad food and the mutual understanding that none of you signed up for this. You whisper about how long you think you'll last. No one says what they're really thinking. I don't want to kill anyone. I don't want to die. There's one night, a few weeks in, where you're lying in your bunk and someone yells out, "Hey, what if we all just refuse to go?" There's a long silence. Then, someone else laughs. Someone else says, "They just send the next batch." You all go quiet again. You stare at the ceiling and feel the weight of inevitability sitting on your chest like a brick. You learn how to march, shoot, stab, climb, dig, endure. They give you a fake Vietnamese village to practice on. Cardboard huts, mannequins dressed like farmers. You throw a grenade into the hut and watch it explode. A sergeant claps you on the back and says, "Good kill." You throw up behind a tree. They teach you to shoot without thinking, to move without questioning, to dehumanize without blinking. You stop being you. You start being useful. The letters from home get weird. Your mom sends prayers. Your dad sends proud one-liners. Your girlfriend's handwriting gets messier, then stops altogether. You pretend it doesn't matter. You tell yourself you're too busy to care. You read the letters in the latrine and sometimes cry so softly no one hears. You get your orders. You're going to Nam, someplace called Coochie, near Saigon. They show you photos of the jungle. They show you what a booby trap looks like. They don't show you what napalm does to children. You're standing with a bunch of guys in uniform. Your duffel bag is digging into your shoulder. You've been awake for 22 hours, and your stomach is full of nerves and military-issue spaghetti. You board the plane like it's a funeral procession. It takes off. You watch the country disappear beneath the clouds and realize, with a cold clarity, nothing will ever be the same. You land in Vietnam under a sun that feels like a punishment. It punches through the windows of the C-130 transport plane and slams into your face with all the subtlety of a brick wall. It's not just ho-tits aggressive. The air is wet. The kind of wet that makes your underwear stick to you within seconds. You feel like you've stepped inside someone else's mouth. You're herded off the plane at Tan Son Nut Air Base. Your boots hit the tarmac. Boom. You're officially in country. And that's when the smell hits you. A mix of rotting vegetation, burning garbage, diesel fuel, sweat, and something else you can't quite place. Later, you'll realize it's fear. The whole place reeks of it. First lesson. Everything here wants you dead. The jungle isn't green. It's loud. It hisses. It hums. It pulses like it's alive, like it's watching you. The trees drip with humidity and suspicion. There are vines everywhere hanging, slithering, tangling around your ankles like they're trying to drag you down. Mosquitoes the size of nickels swarm your neck. You slap, miss. Slap again, bleed. Welcome to the war. They give you a helmet, a flak jacket, an M16 that jams when it gets too dirty, which is always, and a vague set of orders. Your job is to survive and kill people. In that order, if possible. You're attached to an infantry platoon, 3rd Squad, Charlie Company. Some of the guys have been here a while. Their eyes are hard, their humor is broken, their boots are soaked in mud and blood. They call you Cherry, as in fresh meat. You're 10,000 miles from home. You're carrying 70 pounds of gear. And you don't know what the hell you're doing. First patrol. You hike through waist-high elephant grass. It cuts your arms like razors. Your pack feels heavier with every step. Your boots squelch with every footfall. You can't tell where the trail begins or ends. There are no signs, no maps, just green, endless green, like you're walking through a painting done by someone who hates you. Every 10 minutes, you stop and listen. Not for noise, for lack of noise. That's when it happens. A click. You don't hear it. You feel it. Someone steps on a mine 20 feet ahead. Sudden explosion. Body in the air. Then silence. Then screaming. You don't sleep that night. You lie in your foxhole, heart jackhammering. The jungle whispers to you, a chorus of insects and ghosts. You imagine every rustle is Charlie, creeping in with an AK and a smile. Your hands shake. You think about your mother's kitchen. You think about dying in the dirt, far from everything that ever made you feel human. You think, I can't do this. But you do, because no one gives you a choice. Days blend. Time isn't real anymore. You patrol, you sweat, you itch. You drink tepid water from a canteen that tastes like rust. You eat food out of a can labeled beef product that may or may not be beef. You get diarrhea. You get jungle rot. You get leeches in places you didn't know leeches could go. You stop caring. You start to laugh when someone farts in the middle of a firefight. You find God in a mud puddle. You lose him again in the next ambush. You forget what your girlfriend's voice sounds like. You start to wonder if she ever existed. Then comes the first kill. It's not clean. It's not cinematic. It's not heroic. It's a kid, maybe 16, maybe younger. He pops up out of the bush with a rifle and bad aim. You shoot first. You don't think you can't think. Your body moves before your mind does. He crumples. His eyes stay open. You don't puke. You don't cry. You just stand there and stare at the body until someone yells at you to keep moving. That night, you tell yourself it was him or you. That night, you whisper sorry into the dark. That night, you don't sleep again. You keep going. You get better at not dying. You learn to walk a certain way, to scan the trees like they owe you money. You can spot tripwires in the underbrush, smell ambushes before they happen. You learn to trust the guy next to you. You learn to hate the officer behind you. You realize the war isn't about freedom or democracy or stopping communism. The war is about staying alive. That's it. That's all. You stop asking questions. You stop hoping for answers. You run into a village. It's supposed to be friendly. Women stare. Children beg. Men glare. You don't speak the language. You point your rifle and smile and pray nobody has an RPG under their rice bowl. You search huts. You knock over shrines. You yell. You threaten. You find nothing. You leave the village worse than you found it. Next week, you hear the village got napalmed. You don't know who did it. You don't ask. You think about the little boy who gave you a flower. You think about how fast flesh burns. One day, your buddy steps on a punji trap. It's bamboo spikes dipped in feces, hidden in a pit. You hear his scream and think it's a joke until you see the blood. You drag him out. His leg looks like raw hamburger. He's metavased out. You never see him again. Later, you find out he made it home with one leg. 3 years later, he shoots himself in his garage. You drink 5 beers and break your hand punching a tree. Sometimes you make jokes. Sick jokes. Awful jokes. You say you're gonna open a travel agency. Tours of Southeast Asia complimentary leeches included. You say you're gonna start a band called Dead Charlie and the Claymores. You say the next guy who calls you a hero is getting punched in the teeth. Sometimes the jokes are the only thing holding you together. You write letters home. You lie. You say you're okay. You say the food's not bad. You say you're making friends. You don't tell them about the body bags. You don't tell them about the smell. You don't tell them you cried when your friend bled out in your lap. You don't tell them you're starting to forget what happiness feels like. The jungle eats everything. Boots rot. Maps vanish. Morals dissolve. You start to wonder who the bad guys really are. You start to understand that the enemy isn't just the Viet Cong. It's the heat, the loneliness, the leadership, the absurdity. It's the country that sent you here to die for a political game they don't even know how to win. You start to think, maybe the guy shooting at me doesn't want to be here either. You lose track of time. You count the days by how many letters you haven't gotten. You count the weeks by how many friends you've buried. You count your sanity in shrapnel and sleepless nights. You stop caring what day it is. You just want to see tomorrow. You've been in country for 5 months, maybe 6. You're not sure anymore. The days melt into each other like jungle sweat. The calendar in your head broke weeks ago. Now, time is measured in ammo rounds, malaria pills, and how many of your guys made it back from the last patrol. You don't write the date on letters anymore. You just write, still alive. You've stopped thinking about home. Your girlfriend's face is blurry. Your mom's voice is a distant radio signal. Even your own name sounds foreign when someone says it. You are private, specialist, or just doc if you're unlucky enough to carry morphine and bandages instead of grenades. You're a uniform, a rifle, and a blood type. That's it. The new guys arrive, cherries. They smell like clean laundry and hope. They ask questions. They shave every day. They carry family photos in leaves. You hate them for it. Not because they're bad people, but because they remind you of who you used to be. You give them nicknames. You laugh when they flinch at mortar fire. You teach them how to piss in a foxhole without getting bit by ants. And you know most of them won't last. Somewhere along the way, you get good at this. You can reload blindfolded. You can walk point and sniff out ambushes like a dog bred for misery. You can drop into a firefight and find cover without thinking, like it's muscle memory. Your hands don't shake anymore. Your stomach doesn't turn at the sight of blood. You can eat a sandwich next to a corpse if you're hungry enough. You've adapted. Congratulations. You're functional in hell. You start to feel invincible. Then your best friend dies. It's stupid. It's always stupid. He's bending down to tie his boot when the bullet hits the side of his neck. Just like that. 1 second he's cursing the mud, the next his eyes are glass. You don't cry. You just stare. Later, you clean his blood off your watch. It never comes out completely. You wear it anyway. The jungle has become familiar. You know which trees make the worst cover. You know which trails the VC like to booby trap. You know which kinds of birds shut up right before things go sideways. The foliage doesn't scare you anymore. What scares you is how normal it all feels. Your squad is family now. Not the kind that hugs, but the kind that will carry your guts back to base in a poncho if things go bad. There's Johnson, who keeps a picture of his dog in his helmet. There's Morales, who can disassemble a claymore while telling a dirty joke. There's Hicks, who hasn't spoken about home once and never takes off his rosary beads. You don't love them. You trust them. That's deeper. You'd die for any one of them. You might have to. You've gotten close to killing people in their sleep. Not the enemy. Your lieutenant. Fresh out of ROTC, shiny boots, compass always pointing the wrong direction, sends you into open rice paddies in broad daylight like it's a training drill. Gets you pinned down twice in 1 week. Almost gets Charlie killed. One night you find yourself fantasizing about accidentally pulling the pin on a grenade near his tent. You don't do it. But you think about it more than once. You see things you can't explain. Bodies that don't look human anymore. Eyes in the jungle that blink and disappear. A kid with half his face gone, still breathing. A man laughing while he bleeds out. You hear voices when you're alone on watch. You talk back to them, just in case. You dream of snakes and fire and helicopters that never land. You wake up sweating through your uniform. Then you eat your powdered eggs and go back to the war. You go on a recon mission and walk into a dead village. It was friendly last month. Now it's a crater. You find a woman's sandal, a child's toy melted into the earth. No bodies, no answers. You stand in the rubble and feel nothing. You start to worry about what that means. Sometimes you kill the wrong people. A farmer who ran too fast. A kid holding what looked like a grenade. A woman who didn't drop her basket fast enough. The rules change by the hour. The enemy doesn't wear a uniform. Sometimes they wave at you in the morning and shoot you in the back that night. You stop asking for clarity. The line between good and evil has evaporated in the heat. Your platoon gets sent to a firebase in the middle of nowhere. It rains for 10 days straight. You dig trenches until your fingers bleed. You sleep standing up. You eat rice laced with rat droppings. You get trench foot. You treat it with whiskey. You get dysentery. You laugh about it. You almost get shot by your own artillery. No one even files a report. War, you learn, is a system of chaos held together by duct tape and denial. You lose track of how many firefights you've been in. You stop flinching when bullets snap past your ears. You stop ducking when mortars fall. You start giving them nicknames. Benny the Boom, Wanda the Whistle. You start thinking the Reaper's a bad shot. You start thinking maybe you'll make it. And that's when the helicopter goes down. You're riding back from a recon op. 6 guys packed in the bird. Everyone's joking, smoking, half asleep. Then the engine coughs. Then the rotors stutter. Then the ground comes up faster than you thought it could. Crash. Screams. Smoke. You wake up covered in blood that isn't yours. 3 guys dead. 1 missing a leg. 1 screaming for his mother. You drag the wounded out and form a perimeter. You hold them off for 4 hours, with 1 good arm and a half empty magazine. When the medevac finally shows up, you're laughing. You don't know why. You get a medal. They call it bravery. You call it surviving badly. The colonel shakes your hand. You get steak for dinner. You haven't tasted steak in months. It tastes like ash. You've become someone else. You walk differently. Talk differently. Your eyes have that faraway glaze you used to see on the old-timers. You stopped flinching weeks ago. Now, it's the quiet that scares you. You're not scared of dying anymore. You're scared of living like this forever. The jungle has seeped into your skin. You smell like mildew and blood and fear, and you don't notice anymore. What you do notice is this: the war has changed. Not officially. The objectives are still the same: search, destroy, repeat. But the tone has shifted. Even the birds are quieter now. There's a weight in the air. It's not just heat. It's a heaviness you can't explain. Like the jungle knows how this ends and is waiting for you to catch up. Your squad's smaller than it used to be. Some guys rotated out. Some went home in bags. Some just snapped and got shipped off to psych wards. There's a kid they sent last month barely out of high school. Blonde hair, Midwest smile, couldn't stop puking the first 3 days. Third week in, he shoots a water buffalo just to watch it die. Says nothing, just stares at the steam rising off its carcass. You start sleeping with one eye open. There's a guy in your platoon who hasn't spoken in 4 days. You think he saw something bad. Or maybe he just heard the wrong thing at the wrong time, and now he's stuck in a loop. You ask him what's wrong. He just hums. One long note, over and over. No one says anything about it. You all just walk around him like furniture. One morning you wake up and your hands won't stop shaking. You think it's withdrawal, or nerves, or karma. You try to eat. The spoon rattles against your teeth. Someone offers you something in a little paper wrap. You don't ask what it is. You swallow it dry and stare into space until the world goes soft at the edges. You start to lose time. You blink and it's evening. You blink again and someone's screaming. You blink again and you're cleaning your rifle with no memory of picking it up. You miss a patrol briefing because you were staring at a tree and forgot you were a person. Someone makes a joke about amnesia. You laugh too hard. The rules break down. Command sends you into villages with no intel. The CO drinks in the open now, doesn't bother hiding the bottle. You hear rumors about a massacre. One of our units wiped out an entire hamlet. Civilians, women, kids, everyone. You ask your LT about it. He tells you to shut up and keep your boots clean. You feel sick. Not because you're surprised, because you're not. You see a kid with his leg blown off, crawling toward his dead mother. You tell yourself you didn't see it. You watch a man get lit on fire by a flare. You tell yourself he was already dead. You hold your friend while he dies crying for his dog. You tell yourself it's better than dying alone. Someone you know starts carving tally marks into his helmet. Confirmed kills, he says. You're not sure if he's proud or ashamed. You stop talking to him altogether. You stop caring about medals. You stop caring about orders. You stop caring about whether this hill or that trail is strategic. Everything feels like a rerun. Bad plan, bad intel, bad luck. Shoot, reload, bury, repeat. You start to believe that nothing matters. And then you stop believing even that. There's a moment when it breaks. Your walking point. The sun's high. The air is thick. Then a mine goes off. Someone behind you. You turn, and it's Morales, or what's left of him. There's blood on your face that isn't yours. You scream. Not out loud, your body does it for you. You freeze. You disassociate. You watch the scene from outside your skull. You float. You detach. You vanish. They have to slap you back into your body. You can't sleep without something in your system. Weed, booze, pills, doesn't matter. You need something to slow the thoughts. Something to dull the edges. You dream of dead things. You wake up soaked. You don't tell anyone. They already know. They've seen it in their own mirrors. Someone jokes that if the VC don't kill you, your liver will. You laugh, then cough, then realize you haven't laughed in weeks. A guy in your unit walks into the jungle one morning and never comes back. No enemy contact, no gunfire, just gone. You look at his bunk that night. His boot still under the cot. His letter home half written. You wonder if he found a way out. Or if he just became another ghost. You get mail. Your girlfriend's married. Your dad wants to know why you haven't written more. Your mom says your little brother got suspended for fighting. You don't care. You crumple the letters into your helmet and use them for rain protection. You stopped being someone's son a long time ago. You start hearing music where there is none. You think you hear helicopters when it's just the wind. You think you see movement in the trees, but it's your reflection blinking back. You talk to your rifle. You name your bayonet. You forget your own name. Your rotation date is coming. You have 2 weeks left. Everyone tells you that's the most dangerous time. Guys, get careless. Guys, stop ducking. Guys get that look in their eyes like they already left their bodies behind. You try to stay focused. You count the days like prison marks on a wall. You feel the edge of it. Freedom, sanity, escape. And it terrifies you. 2 weeks left. You stop walking point. You stop making jokes. You stop trusting anyone who tells you just one more patrol. You've heard the stories. A guy gets popped in his last hour in country. A guy steps on a mine 30 feet from the helipad. A guy gets a Dear John letter, then walks straight into a sniper's crosshairs. You make yourself invisible. You sleep with your boots on. You count each breath like it might be your last. And then it's here, your final morning. They wake you at 4 o'clock. A duffel bag, a clipboard, a silence. Your squad lines up. Some shake your hand. Some can't look at you. You try to say goodbye, but the words catch in your throat like smoke. Johnson gives you his lucky Zippo. You don't smoke anymore, but you take it anyway. You step onto the helicopter. It rises into the morning sky. You don't look back. You land in Oakland. No parade. No music. No welcome sign. Just a clipboard, a uniform exchange, and a stack of paperwork that tries to explain what happened to you in 2 dimensions. The war is over for you, but no one told your nervous system. The first thing you notice is how quiet everything is. Too quiet. No insects, no boots in mud, no distant artillery. Just car horns, polyester, and people living like nothing happened. You walk into a diner and ask for coffee. The waitress looks at your fatigues and frowns. She asks if you killed anyone. You leave without paying. Your parents hug you at the airport. Your mom sobs. Your dad says, "You look good," and then walks away like he's about to break. You sit in your childhood bedroom that night, surrounded by posters and trophies that don't mean anything anymore. There's a baseball glove in the corner. You stare at it like it belongs to someone else. The nightmares start immediately. You see Morales crawling through the mud. You hear the mine go off. You feel the blood on your hands. You wake up screaming into a pillow you've bitten bloody. You drink until the room spins. You drink until you can sleep. You drink until you forget why you started drinking. People ask questions they don't want real answers to. How was it? Did you kill anyone? Are you glad to be home? You smile, nod, shrug. You become fluent in small talk and silence. No one really wants to know. You try to get a job. The first interview, you wear a tie and sweat through it. You can't stop scanning the room for exits. They ask about your time off. You say, military service. They say, thank you for your service. They don't call back. You apply for VA benefits. The line is out the door. The guy ahead of you lost both legs and still gets denied. You wait 4 hours to talk to someone who doesn't look up once. You tell them you can't sleep. They hand you pills. You tell them the pills make it worse. They shrug. You stop going. You try to date again. You take a girl to a movie. There's a helicopter scene. You flinch so hard, You spill popcorn on the couple behind you. She doesn't call back. You don't blame her. You sit alone in bars and watch other people laugh. You pretend you're not watching. You get a dog. You name him Charlie, because irony is the only emotion you trust anymore. You walk him every morning. It helps. You talk to him when no one else is around. Sometimes you think he understands. You get a letter from Johnson. He made it back, married now, 2 kids, works construction. He says he still wakes up thinking he's in the bush. You write him back. You don't say much. You just say, I know. Years pass. But the war doesn't. It follows you into grocery stores and traffic jams and family holidays. It's in the firecrackers on the 4th of July. It's in the way you never sit with your back to the door. It's in the way you still count every exit. People say Vietnam like it was a bad trip, a mistake, a lesson. To you, it's a scar tissue that hums like a tuning fork in your bones. You get older. Your hair grays. Your knees ache. Your uniform doesn't fit anymore. People thank you on Veterans Day. You smile and nod, like always. They say you're a hero. You don't feel like one. You don't feel like anything. Just tired. One day you find that old Zippo from Johnson. It still works. You flip it open, light it, close it again, over and over. Like a heartbeat. Like a memory. You walk past a group of teenagers protesting another war. They hold signs that say, "No more blood for oil." You nod. You keep walking. They don't notice you. You don't mind. You dream of the jungle less now, but sometimes it still calls to you. A whisper in the leaves, a shadow behind your eyes. You wake up and pet the dog. You go for a walk. You breathe. You're still here. In the dense, humid stillness of the Vietnamese jungle, nightfall came with a strange kind of silent zone that didn't feel peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made you wonder what was listening back. Somewhere out there, hidden beyond the trees, the US military had set up loudspeakers, not for music, not for warnings, but for something far more unusual, something intended not to inform but to unsettle. They called it Ghost Tape Number 10. This wasn't just a recording. It was a psychological operation designed to pierce the deeply held spiritual beliefs of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. The tape played at night, echoing through the thick canopy, carried on the humid air like a whisper that had lost its way. What the enemy heard wasn't a warning or a threat, it was the voice of a man who no longer existed. In Vietnamese, the voice moaned, pleaded, cried out for his family, for forgiveness. He said he had died far from home, dishonored, and would never be incarnated. My friends, I have come back to let you know that I am dead, the voice began. I am dead. I am in hell. Just hell. Sometimes other voices joined in, a weeping mother, a begging child. No explosions, no shouting, just sorrow. To understand why this worked, if it worked, is to understand a belief system rooted in reverence for the spirit world. In many Vietnamese traditions, the dead must be buried properly to move on. If a soul dies far from home, if its body is never returned to the earth of its ancestors, it may become restless, lost, alone. The US PSYOPs teams had done their homework. The goal was simple: convince enemy soldiers that their fallen comrades were suffering in the afterlife and that they might be next. It was psychological warfare without bullets. But what made it especially haunting was its ambiguity. It wasn't overtly threatening. It didn't even mention Americans. It simply echoed grief. The suggestion wasn't, "We'll kill you." It was, "Even if you survive, you may never find peace." Some Viet Cong soldiers reportedly covered their ears, chanted prayers, or fired blindly into the jungle to silence the voice. Others laughed nervously, dismissing it as superstition. But not everyone could ignore it. Fear of death is one thing. Fear of being forgotten by the world and by the next was something else entirely. The voices were real, too. The crying, the wailing. They weren't computer-generated or staged. Some accounts suggest they were recorded from actual individuals, possibly even from refugee actors or former prisoners. That blurred line between fiction and fact, between performance and pain made it harder to write off. Harder to escape. Soldiers on both sides reported strange things during those nights. Shadows moving where they shouldn't. Unexplained whispers. A sensation of being watched. It's impossible to know how much of that was psychological suggestion and how much was simply the jungle playing tricks. But for those who lived it, the nights were long, and sleep came slowly, if at all. The tape was part of a larger initiative called Operation Wandering Soul. But Ghost Tape number 10 was its most infamous creation. Not because of its volume or reach, but because of its tone. It wasn't violent. It was mournful. It didn't rage, it grieved. That's what made it linger. Over time, the jungle grew quieter. The tape played less frequently. The war pressed on, with new strategies and new technologies. But even decades later, some veterans, both American and Vietnamese, claim they can still recall the sound. Not just the words, but the feeling behind them. A kind of sadness that didn't belong to anyone in particular, but somehow belonged to everyone. Ghost Tape, number 10, wasn't about victory. It wasn't even really about fear. It was about lost the possibility of it, the weight of it, the echo it leaves behind. In a war full of machines and gunfire, it was one of the rare tools that used silence as a weapon. And in many ways, that silence has never quite stopped echoing. But even this strange strategy had its limits. Because in the jungles of Vietnam, fear wasn't only something you heard. Sometimes, it was something you walked through, something you lived in, something you tunneled under. Which brings us to a very different kind of darkness, the one that lived just beneath your feet. The Coochie tunnels. Beneath the forest floor of Coochie, just outside of Saigon, there stretched a network of tunnels so vast and complex that it bordered on the surreal. Dug by hand over the course of decades and expanded rapidly during the Vietnam War, these tunnels became a hidden world one where the line between survival and invisibility blurred. From above, it looked like any other part of the jungle. Trees swayed, birds called, and the foliage swallowed sound. But just a few feet below, entire units of Viet Cong soldiers were living, breathing, eating, planning, and waiting. Waiting for footsteps, for engines, for the vibrations that meant someone was walking directly over them. The Coochie tunnels weren't just holes in the ground. They were a multi-level maze, stretching more than 120 miles. There were living quarters, makeshift hospitals, kitchens, armories, meeting rooms, and trapdoor exits spaced just far enough apart to disappear before anyone could follow. In some places, the tunnel ceilings were barely wide enough for a person to crawl through on their stomach. In others, you could crouch, but not fully stand. The air was still, humid, and smelled of earth, sweat, and survival. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't supposed to be. But it was safe, in the sense that safety was relative. For the Viet Cong, these tunnels were a refuge from relentless bombing, from napalm, from helicopters that scanned the treetops like mechanical hawks. Underground, time moved differently. Food was limited, so was oxygen. Light came from candles or small oil lamps, and the enemy was always nearby. For American soldiers, the tunnels were a source of constant dread. Every clearing might conceal a trap door. Every route might be a tripwire. The decision to enter one of these tunnels was not made lightly. Those who volunteered or were ordered to go in became known by a term that still carries a quiet kind of weight: tunnel rats. Armed with only a flashlight and a pistol, These men crawled into the blackness with no idea what they might find. Sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes it was a dead end. And sometimes it was something waiting. The Viet Cong knew their tunnels better than anyone. They laid traps, spiked pits, grenades rigged to strings, narrow corridors that forced intruders into vulnerable positions. A single wrong move could be enough to vanish without sound. Claustrophobia was a constant. The walls pressed in, the air thinned, the flashlight flickered, and the possibility of encountering someone or something down there felt not only likely, but inevitable. Those who came back out often did so, shaken, coughing, and pale. Others didn't come back at all. And then there were the ventilation shaft small, cleverly disguised openings that allowed just enough airflow to keep the tunnels breathable. They were hidden under termite mounds or hollowed-out tree stumps. American forces learned to look for them, sometimes by watching where the grass moved or the insects gathered. But by the time a shaft was found, its users were usually long gone, deeper underground or already behind the next tree line. The tunnels allowed the Viet Cong to appear, attack, and vanish like smoke. Entire battalions could pass through the area without ever knowing they'd been walking over an underground base. Some U.S. units found themselves ambushed by enemies who had, just hours before, been lying beneath them in total silence. Attempts to destroy the tunnels included saturation bombing, poison gas, and flooding. Some entrances were blown open and sealed shut, but the tunnels were resilient. For every destroyed path, another seemed to open. They weren't just escape routes. They were part of a philosophy of warfare that emphasized endurance, patience, and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy could pursue. In time, the jungle reclaimed many of the entrances. Moss grew over the trapdoors. The earth settled. But even today, some parts of the Coochie tunnels remain intact and open to the public. Tourists crawl through widened versions of the original passageways, snapping photos, unaware that they are only experiencing a small, sanitized version of what those tunnels really were. Because what made them terrifying wasn't just the darkness or the danger. It was the idea that something could be so close, so present, and yet entirely invisible. That an entire world could exist just beneath the soles of your boot sand, that you might never know until it was too late. But for all their darkness, the tunnels were still places built by human hands. The next place we go wasn't built at all, it was sprayed. A chemical meant to clear the forest, but it did more than that. Much more. Agent Orange and the Chemical Silence. The idea was deceptively simple. Remove the jungle, and you remove the hiding places. Take away the trees, the crops, the thick canopy that shielded enemy fighters, and the war would become visible. Manageable, winnable. That was the logic behind the widespread use of herbicides during the Vietnam War. Chief among them was Agent Orangia, name that, at the time, meant very little to most. Today, it means something different. It lingers in soil, in bodies, in memory. Between 1961 and 1971, over 20 million gallons of herbicides were sprayed across Vietnam, Laos, and parts of Cambodia. Agent Orange made up a significant portion of that roughly 11 million gallons. The chemical was delivered from above, helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft flying low over forests and farmland, releasing a mist that settled slowly downward. Leaves browned, trees withered, and entire forests were stripped bare in weeks. From the air, it looked like progress. The goal was defoliation. The enemy couldn't hide in a treeless jungle, or so the strategy went. But what made Agent Orange so effective at killing vegetation was also what made it so dangerous. It contained dioxin, specifically TCDD, one of the most toxic compounds known to science. At the time, its long-term effects weren't fully understood, or perhaps they were simply overlooked. For the people below farmers, villagers, children, soldiers, there was no warning. The spray settled on food, on clothes, on skin, It entered water sources and seeped into the ground. Fields died. Rice wouldn't grow. Livestock became sickly, then disappeared altogether. And the people, both those who fought and those who didn't, began to change, slowly and irreversibly. Veterans returned home to find that their health had changed. Some developed cancers. Others experienced rashes, nerve disorders, chronic pain. Children were born with unusual conditions. In Vietnam, generations have come and gone since the last planes passed overhead. But the consequences remain. In some areas, dioxin levels are still high enough to register on modern tests. It didn't go away. It just settled in. What makes this legacy especially haunting is that many of the effects weren't immediate. There were no explosions, no smoke or screaming, just silence. The jungle fell still, crops refused to grow. A child was born years later with a condition that doctors couldn't quite explain. The timeline was too long, the connections too diffuse, but the suspicion was always there, hovering like the mist itself. And then there were the questions, uncomfortable, unanswered questions. How much did the governments involved know? Were the risks understood and dismissed, or genuinely underestimated? Was deforestation ever worth this kind of price? Those questions remain as unresolved as many of the illnesses themselves. Some settlements were paid, some recognition was offered, but in many places, life simply had to go on. Today, the term Agent Orange is shorthand for environmental devastation, but in Vietnam, it's more than a phrase. It's a memory that's passed down in families, in the soil that no longer bears fruit, in the children who require care their entire lives, in the quiet spaces where nothing grows and hasn't for decades. And yet, amid all of this, one detail tends to be forgotten. It wasn't just about war, it was about belief in control of nature, of outcomes, of consequences. It was the idea that if you could clear away the complexity, the conflict would resolve. But nature doesn't work that way. Neither does history. Because the jungle did not give up easily. It always came back. And in many places, it returned with a kind of quiet defiance. Trees grew where nothing should have survived. Roots cracked through poisoned soil. And through it all, people endured carrying memories that science still struggles to explain. But Agent Orange wasn't the only silent force in the war. Some things weren't chemical, or even physical. Some things existed only in the mind, in the space between what you saw and what you feared. Some things were built from sound, from belief, from the voices of the past refusing to stay quiet, and deep in the jungle, those voices were waiting. The Phoenix Program. At first glance, it had the sound of something ancient, something mythological. The Phoenix Program. A name chosen, perhaps, for its connotation of death and rebirth, of rising from ashes. But in Vietnam, it became known for something else entirely. A clandestine campaign to dismantle an invisible network through tactics that were anything but myth. The Phoenix Program was designed to root out the enemy's infrastructure, to find those who weren't in uniform but still fought, not on the battlefield but in villages, in meetings, in whispers. The Viet Cong's strength wasn't just in numbers or weapons, it was in their organizational structure. A web of informants, couriers, recruiters, political officers, people who never picked up a rifle but made everything else possible. The Phoenix Program was conceived to eliminate that web, to neutralize the underground, to cut the cords holding the puppet's limbs. This was intelligence work only. It didn't always follow the rules one might expect. Supported by the CIA and involving South Vietnamese forces, it relied on a decentralized network of interrogation centers, informants, and field units. Names were collected, files were assembled, suspicions were raised. Then came the operations. Sometimes arrests, sometimes interrogations, sometimes disappearances. The official purpose was to gather intelligence and dismantle covert cells. In practice, things grew murkier. The difference between a suspect and a target could be vague. The difference between a confession and a guess could be blurred. And in the fog of war, a wrong accusation often had no appeal process. Many of the detained were questioned with an intensity that left scars physical, psychological, or both. Numbers vary, depending on who's telling the story. Officially, the Phoenix program led to the neutralization of over 80 suspected Viet Cong operatives. Of those, more than 26 were killed. Some reports suggest much higher figures. Others caution that not all those neutralized were enemy agents at all. Some were ordinary villagers. Some were victims of personal grudges, mistaken identity, or being in the wrong place when the paperwork arrived. In many cases, secrecy was prioritized over clarity. Local militias received names without context. Interrogations were carried out in hidden facilities, often without oversight. The methods used, though rarely detailed, have been described in official reports with words like coercive, unregulated, and occasionally extrajudicial. And the program spread. By 1971, there were dozens of detention centers across South Vietnam. Each one a small node in a larger, invisible machine. For those involved in executing the program, the burden was often quiet but lasting. Some spoke years later about the confusion they felt chasing shadows, acting on whispers, seeing people vanish into a system they didn't fully understand. Others maintained that it was necessary that in a war without borders, there could be no traditional front lines. The enemy was everywhere, and delay meant death. And yet, the program left behind an unease that still resists resolution. Its secrecy made it effective. It also made it almost impossible to verify. The names, the files, the outcomes, many were destroyed, buried, or forgotten. What remains are fragmented accounts, testimonies, regrets. After the war, investigations were opened. Some condemned the Phoenix program as a campaign of targeted killings. Others defended it as an unfortunate necessity. Most agreed on one thing. It was unlike anything else being done at the time. It was intelligence warfare that blurred the line between soldier and suspect, between strategy and fear. In the villages where operations took place, people remembered. Not always the names or the agents, but the feeling, the knock on the door, the eyes watching from the tree line. The sense that someone might be listening and that silence was safer than truth. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the program was phased out, officially closed in 1972. Unofficially, pieces of it lingered in other forms, other places, but its imprint remained. In policy, in rumor, in the tension that lives in memory long after the agents have gone. Because there's something particularly haunting about a system that operates in shadow where accountability is diffuse and outcomes are permanent. It asks not what you've done, but what you might do. And in that space between possibility and paranoia, decisions are made that can't be undone. But even this had structure. Even this had files, orders, names. The next terror didn't need paperwork. It didn't even need people. All it needed was the land itself, a few sticks of bamboo, some fishing line, a whisper of movement, and then nothing. Booby traps. In a war defined by uncertainty, few things captured the sense of ever-present danger quite like the booby trap. These were not grand displays of force. There were no bombs dropped from high above, no overwhelming firepower. These were small, simple, and silent. And perhaps that's what made them so unnerving. A war where death didn't come from the sky but from the soil beneath your boots. The Vietnamese landscape was layered with these quiet threats. Some were crafted with military precision, Others were built using whatever was available: wire, nails, sticks, cans, shards of metal. To step through the jungle or along a trail was to play a constant guessing game. Where is it? What have I missed? What will I not know until it's too late? The most notorious and most feared were the punji stick traps, bamboo stakes sharpened to needle points, then smeared with substances no one wanted to describe out loud. These traps were often concealed at the bottom of narrow pits, camouflaged with brush and soil. A soldier, stepping on a patch of innocent-looking ground, could suddenly find himself impaled through the foot, the leg, or worse. These weren't always meant to kill. Sometimes, they were meant to require rescue, to slow the unit, to spread fear. But punji pits were only the beginning. There were tripwire grenades, often rigged to tree trunks or hidden in doorways. A branch could hold a small, rusted can inside the can of grenade. Pull the wrong leaf, and the jungle answered back. In villages, booby traps could be disguised as everyday objects: a child's toy, a piece of clothing, a bowl left out too deliberately. Some were linked to doors or window shutters. Others waited under floorboards. The ingenuity was unsettling. There were traps that used mechanical spring mechanisms, swinging weights, even scorpions or snakes placed strategically in containers. Some were designed to trigger hours later, with delayed fuses or environmental triggers. A soldier could pass by in safety only for the next man to walk into disaster. American troops learned to scan constantly. Eyes down, then up, then sideways. Never relax, never assume. Some units even designated a specific man whose only job was to watch for traps, a role that carried its own burden of stress and responsibility. But even vigilance wasn't always enough. The jungle was patient. The traps were cheap, and the human brain wasn't built for endless alertness. What made these devices so psychologically taxing wasn't just their presence, it was their invisibility. Bullets could be seen, enemy combatants could be engaged, but a wire the width of a pencil lead? A pit covered with damp leaves? These couldn't be fought, only survived. And the effects weren't just physical. Soldiers began to distrust the land itself. The act of walking became a source of anxiety. Every branch might be the last one touched. Every rock might mark a grave. Units moved slower. Confidence eroded. Even success felt precarious. How do you win against an enemy you can't see, using weapons you can't detect? Some traps were found, disarmed, mapped, but others were left behind, forgotten by those who built them, waiting for those who never suspected. Even after the war ended, civilians continued to find them. Farmers, children, hikers, an old can in a field, a cord buried beneath the weeds, a reminder that the war had never truly left. Today, explosive ordnance disposal teams still comb parts of Vietnam. Decades later, the soil still holds its secrets. Maps are redrawn, warnings are posted, but the land remembers. What was once strategy is now legacy. And through it all, one truth remains. Fear doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits in silence, inches beneath your step. But if traps were the physical embodiment of fear, there was another kind of fear born not from injury, but from betrayal, from confusion, from looking at the man beside you and realizing you weren't sure if he was your ally, your enemy, or something in between. In a war that twisted loyalties and blurred lines, the next threat didn't come from underground. It came from within. Fragging and the breakdown within. Wars are typically told in terms of opposing sides' uniforms, flags, languages, beliefs. The narrative is clean, even when the reality is not. But Vietnam was not that kind of war. The edges bled into each other. There were enemies without uniforms, battles without front lines, and most unsettling of all, divisions within the very units that were supposed to function as one. In this chaos, a new and chilling term entered the military lexicon: fragging. The word came from the fragmentation grenade, a small, easily concealed explosive used by infantry, but in this context, it meant something darker. Fragging was the act of deliberately killing one's own commanding officer. Not in combat, not in confusion, but on purpose. Usually under the cover of night, often while the officer slept, and almost always unspoken afterward. The reasons were complex. Some soldiers saw certain officers as reckless, too eager to send men into danger for questionable objectives. Others felt they were out of touch, unaware of the true cost of decisions made from the rear. There was resentment, frustration, fear, and beneath it all, the slow erosion of command authority in a war that seemed increasingly surreal. Vietnam wasn't like previous wars. Morale was fragile, especially as the conflict dragged on with no clear end in sight. Drafted soldiers served one-year tours, cycling in and out of a war zone with little continuity. Meanwhile, officers were often career military, trying to secure promotions in a system that measured success through body counts and territory-cleared metrics that didn't always reflect reality on the ground. As the war lost public support back home, many soldiers began to question the very premise of their deployment. Desertion rates increased, drug use spread. And in this environment, the idea of fragging became a whispered possibility, a last resort for those who felt trapped between a dangerous enemy and a dangerous order. Most fragging incidents were never officially solved. The evidence was difficult to gather, and the consequences were rarely pursued aggressively. A tent would explode, a lieutenant would not wake up. An investigation might follow, but leads often disappeared into silence. The culture of secrecy and survival was strong. Talk too much, and you could be next. Estimates vary, but hundreds of fragging incidents were recorded between 1,969 and 1,972, with many more suspected. Not all resulted in deaths, some were intended as warnings. A grenade rolled under a bunk and detonated without casualties. A weapon discharged during a patrol under unclear circumstances. The message was implicit: back off, change your orders, or don't come back. And then there were the ripple effects. Officers became more cautious, not of the enemy, but of their own men. Some refused to sleep near their troops. Others avoided giving certain orders. The traditional military hierarchy began to fray. Trust, already strained by the pressures of guerrilla warfare, started to unravel completely. Fragging wasn't about individual hatred. It wasn't personal, at least not usually. It was systemic, a sign that something fundamental had broken down, that the bonds meant to hold units together, discipline, loyalty, respect, had been weakened to the point where survival came first, no matter the cost. For the soldiers who lived through it, fragging left an uneasy mark. It was rarely discussed openly, even years later. It didn't fit into the tidy categories of bravery or sacrifice. It didn't look good in memorials or museums, but it happened. Enough times that commanders changed how they operated. Enough times that the Pentagon took notice. Enough times that it became part of the hidden history of the war. And maybe the most disturbing thing wasn't that it happened, but that it made a certain kind of sense in a place where logic no longer seemed to apply. Because in Vietnam, danger wasn't just out there. It could be in your squad, in your tent, in your silence. But even within that silence, there were moments that slipped into the realm of the unexplainable. Not betrayal, not vengeance, something different. Something that couldn't be blamed on orders or politics. A quiet madness, shared in the heat, fueled by something stronger than fear, or maybe something simpler, something chemical. Soldiers on LSD. It wasn't officially part of the war, not written into strategies or briefed in morning meetings, but somewhere along the humid arc of the Vietnam conflict, amid the sweat and the static, a different kind of warfare took hold on that didn't require bullets or boundaries. It happened inside the mind. It slipped into perception, rewrote reality, and sometimes never quite left. In the late years of the war, a growing number of U.S. soldiers began navigating combat not with heightened awareness, but under the influence of hallucinogens. The most infamous among them, LSD. The story of drugs in Vietnam is often summarized with a shrug: marijuana in the barracks, heroin in the cities, a coping mechanism for a war that seemed to defy meaning. But hallucinogens were different. They didn't numb, they altered. And while not officially distributed by command, LSD and other psychedelic substances began making their way into the boots and rations of soldiers looking for escape, or maybe just a different angle on a war that already felt surreal. It wasn't widespread at first. The early years of U.S. involvement saw tight discipline and a focus on traditional military conduct. But as the war dragged on, as rotations blurred and morale eroded, the rules softened. LSD, brought in through black markets or sent in care packages, was shared quietly. Sometimes as a joke, sometimes as an experiment, sometimes as a ritual. The experience varied. Some reported visions of extraordinary clarity, colors blooming from the jungle canopy, sounds unfolding like stories. Others described disintegration. The jungle breathed, trees moved. Voices whispered things that made sense at the time and none at all afterward. Combat under LSD was a different kind of terror. Some soldiers claimed the drug made them fearlessable to walk into fire without hesitation, as if death had become abstract. Others couldn't move at all, frozen in place by the overload of sensation. There were accounts quiet, mostly anecdotal, of entire patrols wandering off course, lost not to the enemy, but to a landscape that had stopped obeying the rules. And then there were the shared hallucinations. More than once, groups of soldiers reported seeing the same thing. A figure watching from the tree line, a face in the ground, a child with eyes too old. Were these real? A trick of expectation? The mind searching for structure in a war that offered none? The military command, for its part, was concerned but not always clear in its response. By the early 1970s, surveys conducted by the Department of Defense revealed that a significant portion of enlisted men had experimented with drugs while in Vietnam. LSD was harder to trace than heroin, harder to regulate than alcohol. It didn't leave a clear trail, just stories, just questions. Some veterans described the experience years later with a kind of reverence. A spiritual awakening, they said. A glimpse beyond the veil. Others refused to speak of it at all. One man remembered watching a firefight unfold, as if it were a film being projected through the sky. Another said he saw his own face in the eyes of the man he was ordered to shoot. Neither of them could say if what they saw was real. The truth is, the Vietnam War didn't need LSD to feel dreamlike. The blurred lines of loyalty, the shifting rules of engagement, the contradictions of purpose, all of it already carried a certain hallucinatory quality. But with psychedelics in the mix, the veil thinned even further. The jungle wasn't just a setting, it became a character, a presence, sometimes hostile, sometimes divine. And when the trip ended, the war remained. The same ground, the same noise, the same orders. Only now, there was a lingering sense that something had changed. That reality had shifted slightly, and might not shift back. For some, it was just a phase. For others, it never fully wore off. But if drugs could unmoor a soldier from reality, there was another force in the war that unmoored entire communities. A betrayal deeper than hallucination, a promise made and never kept. High in the Central Highlands, a group of people once fought alongside U.S. forces, believing they would be protected. They were wrong, and their story still echoes in the mountains. The Montagnard Betrayal. High in the misty ridgelines and forested valleys of Vietnam's Central Highlands lived a collection of indigenous tribes known collectively as the Montagnards, a French word meaning mountain people. It was a label as foreign to them as the politics that would one day consume their homes. These were communities with their own customs, languages, and belief systems, spirit-centered cultures with deep ties to the land. When the war came, they didn't bring it, but it found them anyway. To the U.S. military, the Montagnards represented a strategic opportunity. Here was a population largely disconnected from the communist-aligned lowland Vietnamese and often mistrustful of them. Many Montagnards had long-standing grievances with the government in Saigon, which had marginalized them both politically and economically. For American advisors, this mistrust became an opening. The CIA, through its Civilian Irregular Defense Group, CIDG, program, began recruiting Montagnards in the early 1960s. They were trained, armed, and organized into village defense units and special operations teams. These men knew the terrain better than anyone. They moved silently through the jungle, tracked without maps, and fought with a deep understanding of the forest. They became valuable, allies loyal, capable, and fiercely committed to the units they served with. Tens of thousands of Montagnards fought alongside U.S. forces during the war. They patrolled borders, guarded outposts, and sometimes took on the most dangerous missions. Many died doing so. Their villages were targeted by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters who considered them traitors. Their families paid the price. But for a time at least, there was a bond. American Green Berets formed close connections with the Montagnard fighters they trained. Some even lived in their villages, sharing food and customs, forging what they believed would be a lasting alliance. But alliances in war are fragile. And when U.S. involvement began to wind down in the early 1970s, the future of the Montagnards grew uncertain. Promises had been made of protection, of relocation, of support. Quiet promises, often undocumented. When the final American units left, many Montagnard communities were left exposed. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, retribution came swiftly. The new Vietnamese government viewed Montagnards with suspicion and hostility. Thousands were sent to re-education camps. Others were forcibly relocated. Their lands were seized. Their languages suppressed. The same mountains that once offered shelter now became places to hide from those they had once considered neighbors. A few were able to escape. Some resettled in the United States, where small Montagnard communities still exist today, particularly in North Carolina and other parts of the Southeast. Many, however, remained behind living in remote regions, disconnected from state support, carrying the memory of a war that had promised them safety and delivered something else. The betrayal wasn't one moment. It was a slow, unfolding silence. As years passed, the Montagnards became a footnote in the larger narrative of the Vietnam War. Their names were rarely included in official counts, their sacrifices often unmentioned in retrospectives. But their absence is its own kind of presenza, quiet space, where a promise once lived. For those who remember, the feeling is hard to describe. It's not just loss, it's displacement. A sense of having stood in history's path, only to be brushed aside when the story moved on. And for the American soldiers who fought alongside them, there remains a complicated guilt bond formed in crisis, left unresolved in peace. Today, parts of the Central Highlands have changed. Roads have been built, tourism has arrived. But in certain villages, the older generation still speaks of the war in terms not of ideology, but of memory. They remember the Americans. They remember the radios, the weapons, the uniforms. And they remember how it ended. The Montagnard story is not one of defeat, exactly. It's something more fragile, more enduring. It's what happens when trust becomes strategy, and then becomes casualty. A story not about battle, but about what happens when the battle moves on without you. And while the mountains still hold that memory in their ridges and valleys, there is another kind of silence that stretches across Vietnam's field zone, left behind not by abandonment, but by explosives that never quite fulfilled their purpose. They were left behind by the thousands, dormant and invisible. They wait still. Unexploded ordnance. When a war ends, it doesn't always leave. Sometimes it stays behind, not in speeches or statues, but buried quietly in the earth. In Vietnam, the war lingers beneath the surface in a literal way. Across the countryside, hidden in rice paddies, forests, and schoolyards, are the remnants of a conflict that dropped more tonnage of explosives than both world wars combined. Not all of those bombs went off. Some chose silence, and that silence has lasted decades. These are the unexploded ordnance UXO for short, a term that sounds clinical, almost abstract, but the reality is anything but. These are artillery shells, landmines, cluster bombs, and grenades that never detonated as intended. They were left behind by the hundreds of thousands, scattered across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, like forgotten punctuation at the end of an unfinished sentence. During the Vietnam War, U.S. forces conducted massive bombing campaigns, especially in areas suspected of harboring Viet Cong activity. Entire regions were carpet-bombed in arcs of steel and fire. But not every device functioned correctly. Some lodged deep in the soil. Others came to rest just beneath the surface. The war moved on. The weapons stayed. And they're still there. In the years since the war's end in 1975, unexploded ordnance has caused tens of thousands of civilian casualties, many of them children. A farmer tilling a field hit something metallic. A group of boys finds a curious round object in the underbrush. A young girl walks to school and hears a sharp click beneath her foot. In these moments, time stretches, then contracts, then disappears. There are regions of Vietnam where warning signs are posted not for wild animals or steep trails, but for bombs. Whole communities have adapted their lives around them. Paths are rerouted. Land remains uncultivated. Some fields have become permanent no-go zones, not because of the terrain, but because of what lies just beneath it. Efforts to clear UXO have been ongoing for decades. International NGOs, local governments, and bomb disposal teams work with metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and sheer patience. It's slow, expensive, and dangerous work. A single demining operation might take weeks just to clear a small area. Some devices are so old and degraded that any attempt to move them could trigger detonation. Others are too deep to detect without heavy equipment. The psychological toll is difficult to quantify. In some communities, there's a quiet fear that passes from one generation to the next, not the fear of war, but the fear of something forgotten, something left behind. Children grow up knowing which areas to avoid. Parents worry not about enemy soldiers, but about the ground itself. And yet, daily life continues. Markets open, schools hold classes, rice is planted. The threat becomes background, noise ever present, rarely acknowledged. It's a strange kind of peace, a conditional one. What makes unexploded ordnance especially haunting is its passivity. These weapons are not being fired. They are not aimed. They simply wait, silent, motionless, until something disturbs them. They are not malicious. They are indifferent. And in that indifference lies a special kind of danger. There are stories, of course. A man who found a shell and placed it on his porch, not knowing what it was. A child who played with a rusted object shaped like a ball. A fisherman who pulled something heavy from the water, curious until it began to hiss. The war may have ended, but it still finds its way back into people's lives, one fragment at a time. Vietnam is not alone in this. Laos, in particular, remains one of the most heavily bombed countries per capita in history. Cambodia, too, carries its own legacy of UXO. But in Vietnam, the land has absorbed it deeply. Fields that once bore witness to conflict now grow food, raise families, and carry risk beneath every step. And what do you do with that? How do you live on soil that remembers everything? You learn to move carefully, you learn not to dig too deep, and sometimes you plant new things right beside the past, hoping it stays quiet. But not every hidden danger lies beneath the earth. Some are carried in the body, passed down through blood and time. The next terror was sprayed, not dropped. It clung not to terrain, but to generations. And it still raises questions science can't fully answer. The black syphilis rumor. Some stories from war survive not because they are verified, but because they are repeated in low voices, passed from bunk to bunk, whispered in tents late at night when sleep doesn't come. These stories don't need evidence. They don't ask to be believed. They settle in the imagination and wait. One of the most persistent among American troops in Vietnam was the tale of black syphilis, a rumored disease said to rot the body from the inside out, and worse, to drive the mind toward a slow and irreversible unraveling. There is no official record of such a condition. Medical journals from the era list the usual afflictions: malaria, trench foot, heat stroke, dysentery, venereal diseases, both common and treatable. But this one was different. It wasn't listed, it wasn't diagnosed. It was feared, described in fragments, lesions that spread too quickly, skin that darkened, then decayed. A fever that never broke. Eyes that changed, lost their focus. A voice that no longer made sense. No one could say where it came from. Some claimed it was contracted in Saigon brothels. Others insisted it originated in the jungle, a strange mutation of an old disease shaped by the heat and the chemicals. Some thought it was a weapon bioengineered, maybe, and accidentally unleashed. The name itself, black syphilis, had the sound of something invented to frighten. But that didn't stop anyone from repeating it. Rumors grew in proportion to uncertainty. A soldier disappeared from his unit, and someone whispered the name. A man was flown out in the night, no explanation given. A medic burned a mattress and wouldn't say why. The less that was known, the more room there was for story, and where especially this one was fertile ground for story. Some veterans remembered seeing cases that didn't fit the normal pattern. Young men with sudden cognitive decline, unusual rashes, bodies that didn't respond to treatment. Was it a form of late-stage syphilis, worsened by malnutrition and tropical exposure? Was it a combination of infections left untreated in the chaos of the field? Or was it something else entirely, something undocumented, unnamed? The fear had a logic. Soldiers lived in conditions where infection was a constant threat. Sanitation was limited. Medical care, though present, was stretched thin. And stigma, especially around sexual health, meant that many didn't report symptoms early. When a soldier fell ill, others looked the other way. When he was evacuated, they filled in the blanks themselves. And then there was the psychological layer. Vietnam was a war where boundaries dissolved not just geographic, but moral and mental. A man could lose himself without even realizing it. LSD, malaria-induced hallucinations, sleep deprivation all contributed to a war environment where reality wobbled. Black syphilis became a symbol of that mental dissolution. The idea that you might fall apart from within, one cell at a time, and no one would be able or willing to stop it. Some military doctors publicly denied the existence of such a condition. Others remained silent. In later years, analysts suggested that the story served a purpose. It gave form to deeper fears. The fear of contamination, of punishment, of the body betraying itself. It became a metaphor for guilt, for moral infection, for the things that couldn't be washed off or left behind. In war, every rumor has a function. Some protect, others warn. A few, like this one, simply survive because they speak to something unspoken. In the case of black syphilis, it wasn't just about disease, it was about helplessness. The idea that you could do everything right, follow every order, and still be undone by something you couldn't see, whether it existed or not, remains unsettled. The files are quiet, the testimonies are contradictory, but the fear was real, and sometimes that's enough to make a thing last. Because in Vietnam, not all enemies carried rifles. Some came in the form of whispers, some in the form of memories, and some in the form of ordinary people who looked at you with a smile and then ran toward you with something hidden in their hands. Children with grenades. It starts with something ordinary. A young boy standing at the edge of a dirt road. A girl, maybe 7 or 8, walking barefoot between a pair of oxen. A child squatting beside a pond, waving at the convoy as it passes. There's a momenta flicker where a soldier's instinct hesitates. It's a child, after all. A reminder of home. A sign of something human in a place where everything else feels calculated and gray. And then the child runs. Not away. Toward. In a war without a fixed front, where civilians and combatants shared the same space, the line between innocence and threat often blurred and sometimes vanished entirely. One of the most unsettling realities of the Vietnam War was the use of children in combat roles, particularly by the Viet Cong, not in organized units, not in uniform, but as messengers, informants, and, in some cases, as weapons. It didn't start as strategy. It evolved out of necessity. The Viet Cong, outgunned and often isolated, depended on stealth and resourcefulness. Children, small and unassuming, could pass through checkpoints, move freely between villages, and gather intelligence without drawing suspicion. They were eyes and ears, and sometimes they were more. Accounts from the field tell of children carrying satchel charges, grenades, or even simple bundles wired to detonate. Not hundreds of cases, not a policy, but enough to unsettle. Enough that the stories took root and multiplied. A girl approaching a checkpoint with a basket of flowers. A boy carrying a loaf of bread. A group of kids playing by a roadside ditch until one suddenly veers off and tosses something shiny toward a parked vehicle. And what were the soldiers supposed to do? What decision would be right? Fire at a child and live with the question. Hold your fire and live with the consequence. These were not hypothetical dilemmas. They happened on jungle trails, in village alleys, along rice paddy embankments. They left no good answers, only reflexes, regrets, and reports that rarely told the full story. It's easy to view this through the lens of tragedy, and it is, but it's also more complicated. In some cases, children volunteered not out of ideology, but because their families had been killed or displaced, or simply left with no other allegiance. In others, they were coerced. Handed an object and told it would bring honor, or safety, or revenge. What could an 8-year-old understand of such things? The psychological toll on American soldiers was immense. Combat is always disorienting, but facing an enemy who could be 3 feet tall and barefoot added a level of surrealism that many never recovered from. Trust eroded. Compassion became risk. Entire villages were treated with suspicion, and sometimes retribution. The memory of those moments, the brief smile, the sudden movement, the small hands holding something deadly lingered long after the firefights ended. Some veterans reported dreams of children running toward them just before waking in a sweat. Others avoided eye contact with children for years after returning home. Not because they believed it would happen again, but because part of them wasn't sure it wouldn't. And for the Vietnamese children who survived the war, the trauma was different, but no less enduring. Some lost families to the very raids their presence was meant to protect. Others were maimed, orphaned, or marked by the silence that often follows war's ugliest decisions. Many carried no memory of the role they played, only a feeling that something had been taken too early. Today, images from that era circulate in books and documentaries. Grainy photographs of barefoot children beside smoking vehicles, frozen mid-run, their expressions unreadable. These images are not just of war, they are of confusion, of choices made under impossible circumstances, of the way war collapses time and age and identity into a single, irreversible moment. Because the most terrifying part of this wasn't just that it happened, it was that no one knew, in the moment, what was real. A smile could mean welcome or warning. A toy could be a decoy. A child could be both victim and instrument, manipulated by forces far beyond their understanding. And in that space of uncertainty, terror takes root. Not just fear of death, but fear of what it might cost to stay alive. But there was another kind of terror waiting in the margins of this war. One that didn't come from children or bombs or ideology. It came from the land itself. From the biting, buzzing, creeping things. From the sickness that whispered through the sweat. From the fevers that brought dreams if you were lucky and things far stranger if you weren't. The jungle fever. It didn't have a nominate one that stuck. There were official diagnoses, of course. Malaria, dengue fever, scrub typhus, leptospirosis. In the military field manuals, each had its own chapter, a list of symptoms, treatments, cautionary protocols. But out there, in the green crush of the jungle, none of that really mattered. Because by the time the fever arrived, names meant very little. They called it jungle fever, not because it was a single illness, but because it felt like the place itself had turned against you. The jungle beautiful, humming, alive became something else entirely. It watched, it whispered, it waited, and it wore you down. For soldiers in Vietnam, sickness was as constant as the heat. The days were thick with humidity, the nights cold and wet. Even when you weren't actively under fire, your body was. From insects, from parasites, from the ground beneath you. Nothing stayed dry. Nothing stayed clean. Leeches crawled up pant legs and latched onto skin. Mosquitoes formed a haze around helmets. Rats chewed through boots while you slept. And through it all, the fever waited. It started slowly, a tightness behind the eyes, a headache that didn't go away. Then the heat would rise internal, oppressive, as if the jungle had reached inside and decided to rearrange your temperature. You would sweat through your shirt in minutes, then shiver under the same fabric. Muscles ached. Vision blurred. Time lost meaning. The medics did what they could. Quinine for malaria. Antibiotics for what might be bacterial. Rehydration if the vomiting didn't get too bad. But often, treatment was a guess. And soldiers were reluctant to report symptoms. To admit you were sick meant being pulled from your unit. It meant suspicion, weakness. And so, many pushed through, shaking in the back of a patrol, teeth clenched, hoping it would break soon. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. And sometimes, something stranger happened. There were accounts quiet ones, told in retrospect of soldiers who went into the jungle and didn't come back the same. Not injured, not physically altered, just different, quieter, distant. Like something had taken up residence in them during a long, fevered night and never quite left. Some claimed they saw things. Not enemy fighters or wild animals, but figures. Moving through the trees. Watching from the undergrowth. Once, a man swore he saw a duplicate of himself across a clearing, just standing there. His unit laughed it, Off-heat exhaustion, they said. Dehydration. But no one asked him to describe it again. Then there were the dreams. Vivid, elaborate, sometimes violent. Dreams where the jungle wasn't a setting but a character. It spoke in sounds that mimicked radios, in voices that borrowed from fallen comrades. And when you woke, you weren't sure you'd left it behind. These fevers weren't always fatal. Most recovered, eventually. But the recovery wasn't always complete. Joints ached long after the infection passed, memory fractured. Some reported a lingering taste in the mouth, metallic, bitter, like the smell of wet rust. Others lost patches of hair, fingernails, skin. The Vietnamese soldiers suffered, too often more, with fewer resources, less medical support. Entire villages would be swept by illness after monsoon season. Children would waste away with quiet coughs. Parents would boil herbs and whisper prayers. And the jungle watched. And this is what made jungle fever so terrifying. It wasn't personal. It wasn't targeted. It simply was. Present in the air, in the water, in the soil. It did not hate or spare. It treated everyone the same. And in a war already filled with confusion, it became one more layer on, more silent, unrelenting pressure. Because when a bullet comes at you, there's a moment, a sound, a cause. But when the jungle takes you, it does so without announcement. It just rises in your blood and waits. And even for those who made it home, the fever lingered. In immune systems never quite right, in nightmares that returned with summer heat, in a subtle fear of stillness, because stillness, in the jungle, was often the beginning of something worse. But if the jungle could disorient and erase, it also protected. It held secrets tightly, sometimes too tightly, because the next terror wasn't biological or spiritual. It was strategic. A silence so deep, it had to be built, hidden under centuries of roots, waiting to open when the war above demanded it. Operation Wandering Soul. There are many ways to wage war. Some use weapons, others use maps. But sometimes, a war is fought in belief, waged not on the battlefield, but in the quiet spaces between culture, memory, and fear. In Vietnam, where the spiritual world lived close to the everyday one, the U.S. military tried to tap into something older than conflict, something older than language itself. They called it Operation Wandering Soul. To understand it, you have to begin with the belief. In many Vietnamese traditions, especially in rural communities, the dead do not simply vanish. They must be buried properly, with the correct rituals and in the right place, or their spirits may become restless. These wandering souls, it said, can't find peace. They drift. They suffer. They call out. The U.S. Psychological Operations Team studied this closely. With the help of cultural experts and translators, they developed a series of broadcasts designed not to inform or persuade, but to haunt. The centerpiece was a chilling audio recording, what would later be known as Ghost Tape. Number 10. The tape begins softly. A faint wind, a subtle echo. Then the voice comes small, sorrowful, drawn out as if echoing from a cave. My friends, I have come back to let you know that I am dead. I am dead. I am in hell. The voice weeps, pleads, warns. Sometimes, other voices join a grieving mother, a lamenting child. Their words speak of suffering, of dishonor, of spirits trapped far from their ancestral land. The implication is clear. You will die far from home, forgotten, and your soul will never rest. These broadcasts were played at night, through loudspeakers mounted on helicopters, boats, and hidden jungle outposts. In total darkness, the sounds drifted over the treetops, echoing through the canopy. There were no gunshots, no warnings, just sorrow, just the voice. Reports from the field varied. Some soldiers said Viet Cong units abandoned posts after the tapes were played. Others claimed little to no impact. But among those on the ground, American and Vietnamese alike, the broadcast developed a strange aura. Some began to believe the jungle was truly haunted, that something real had been stirred up, and maybe something had. What made Operation Wandering Soul so unsettling wasn't just the audio, it was the strategy. It weaponized belief. It turned a culture's most sacred traditions into tools of psychological manipulation. Not through ridicule, but through imitation. Through eerie mimicry. It wasn't a rejection of the belief, it was a performance of it. One so convincing that even those who staged it began to feel uneasy. Some of the recordings were based on real people. Former prisoners, exiles, actors recruited from local populations. Their pain wasn't always simulated. That ambiguity between fiction and reality gave the tape its power and its weight. In the years since the war, Ghost Tape number 10 has become an artifact. You can listen to it online. The quality is poor-grainy, warped, but even now, it holds something. A sadness, maybe. Or a warning that feels deeper than words. It speaks not to victory or loss, but to something more fundamental, the fear of being forgotten. And that fear did not vanish with the end of the war. In Vietnam today, ghost stories are not uncommon. Soldiers speak of hearing cries in places where battles once raged. Farmers avoid certain patches of land. Children are told to be quiet in the woods not because of wild animals, but out of respect. Was Operation Wandering Soul effective? Strategically? Perhaps only marginally, but emotionally, spiritually it left a trace. It acknowledged a truth that most military strategies ignore, that the mind is a battlefield too. And sometimes the deepest wounds are not made by bullets, but by silence filled with voices. Because in war, what you hear is often less important than what you believe. And once belief is shaken, nothing feels safe. Not even your own thoughts. And yet, if voices in the night were meant to disturb, there were other forces at play in the war that operated in broad daylight, massive, coordinated, and devastating. The next terror wasn't subtle. It didn't whisper. It screamed. It rained from the sky. And for many who lived through it, it was the fire that never went out. Napalm strikes. It came from the sky, but not like rain. Rain cools. This burned. Napalm, an incendiary compound of gasoline thickened with gelling agents, wasn't new by the time it arrived in Vietnam. It had been used in World War II and Korea. But in the jungles and villages of Southeast Asia, it took on a presence all its own. Not just a weapon, not just a tactic, a symbol, a force of nature, manufactured. Napalm didn't explode like a bomb. It stuck, clung to skin, trees, buildings, soil. It ignited on contact and kept burning, even underwater. It was designed not just to kill, but to destroy cover, to burn away the undergrowth where enemy forces might be hiding, to open up the battlefield, clear lines of sight, and send a message. There is nowhere left to hide. And it did that. But it did more. Villages targeted by napalm strikes were often flattened, not by the heat alone, but by the panic that followed. Fires spread unpredictably, whipped by wind, consuming homes in seconds. Survivors fled with their clothes, and sometimes their skin in flames. Trees blackened, rivers steamed. The landscape was left scalded, glowing in places where nothing should glow. The effects on human bodies were especially devastating. The sticky nature of napalm meant that it couldn't be wiped away. It adhered to the skin, seared through clothing, and burned until the oxygen ran out or the body did. For medics, treating napalm burns was a nightmare. Conventional dressings were useless. Pain relief was often inadequate. For those who lived through it, the scarring was permanent, visible, and otherwise. And yet, the use of napalm was considered legal under international law at the time when deployed against military targets. Its deployment was strategic, specific, justified in briefing rooms. On paper, but paper didn't cover the sky. One image would come to define the horror. A young girl, naked, running down a dirt road, her arms outstretched in agony, her back scorched by napalm. Her name was Fan Thier Kim Phuc. Her pain was real. Her photograph, taken in 1972, became iconic. It won prizes. It changed minds. But behind that image were countless others unseen, unnamed. Men, women, children, caught in the margins of a strike zone. For the soldiers on the ground, witnessing a napalm drop was both awe-inspiring and sickening. A roar overhead, a bloom of orange and black, a heat wave that rolled over the treetops. Sometimes, it felt like justice. Other times, like something had gone horribly wrong. Not every drop hit its intended target. Maps shifted. Coordinates misread. In the chaos of battle, errors multiplied. Entire hamlets were reduced to ash over suspicions that would never be confirmed. And the jungle, for all its resilience, could not always recover. In some areas, nothing grew for years. The soil remained warm, unnaturally dry, resistant to life. Today, the legacy of napalm remains controversial. Its use has been curbed under later conventions, but the scars it left on land, on people, on memory endure. In Vietnam, survivors carry those memories in the way they walk, the way they look at fire. In the West, the word napalm itself has become shorthand for the unbearable, the irredeemable, the moment when strategy turns to spectacle. What made it terrifying wasn't just the destruction it caused, it was the sense of certainty behind it. Napalm was deployed not out of chaos, but calculation. It was measured, mapped, and once released, it obeyed only physics, not intention. And in a war already known for its moral ambiguity, napalm drew a line bright, burning, and impossible to cross without consequence. But even in the aftermath of flame, something stranger waited. Not fire, not steel, not sound, a stillness, a tunnel, a place beneath the earth where the rules were different and the war became something even more intimate. A soldier alone, with a flashlight and a sidearm, crawling toward a heartbeat he couldn't see. Tunnel rats. The darkness wasn't just absence, it was pressure. It pushed in from all sides, humid and silent, wrapping around the lungs like cloth soaked in oil. No wind, no light, no room to turn around. This was where the tunnel rats live if you could call it living. They weren't an official unit at first. No flags, no medals, just volunteers. Mostly, though, volunteer. Sometimes meant being the smallest guy in the platoon. They were tasked with one job: enter the tunnels beneath Vietnam's surface, locate the enemy, gather intelligence, and if necessary, clear the way. The Coochie tunnels were the most infamous, but they were only one part of a sprawling subterranean world. Dug by the Viet Cong, these tunnels stretched for hundreds of miles beneath South Vietnam. They weren't random burrows, they were systems. Multi-level, strategically vented, reinforced with bamboo, hidden by trapdoors and camouflaged brush. Some had meeting rooms, others clinics. Some just led into darkness and ended in silence. To enter one was to say goodbye to predictability. Tunnel rats descended into these spaces with little more than a flashlight, a sidearm often, a .45 pistol, for its stopping power in tight quarter-sand nerves already worn thin. Helmets were left behind, they didn't fit. Rifles, too bulky. What remained was instinct, breathing, and the thrum of pulse in the ears. Inside, the air was thick with earth and rot. Sometimes there was water, ankle deep or more. Sometimes rats, actual ones. Snakes. bats, spiders the size of fists. Other times, the tunnels were rigged. Booby traps placed with an artisan's touch, tripwires linked to grenades, bamboo spikes at head height, collapsible floors hiding pits. It wasn't just a physical threat, it was psychological warfare in tight space. The enemy was close, sometimes inches away, silent, waiting. You might catch a whisper, a scrape, or a shadow, and by then it could be too late. A tunnel could twist at angles that made sound bounce strangely, disorienting even the most seasoned rats. One wrong turn, and you were in someone else's territory. Someone who dug it by hand, over years, and knew every bend. What made the experience so uniquely terrifying wasn't just the danger, it was the solitude. On the surface, a soldier had his unit. Down here, it was just him, his flashlight beam. The squeeze of mud against boots, the quiet knowledge that a wrong move could mean never resurfacing. Claustrophobia wasn't a condition, it was a given. And even if you made it through the tunnel, there was the matter of coming back out, into the light, to the sound of helicopters and gunfire, or the even more unsettling quiet of a jungle that had watched everything and said nothing. Some rats went down hundreds of times, others went once and refused to do it again. It wasn't a question of bravery, it was survival. And survival, in those spaces, meant becoming something less than a soldier, and more like a ghostable to move through walls, vanish, and return with something no one else could have seen. Intelligence gathered from these missions was valuable maps, documents, evidence of weapon caches, but the psychological cost was hard to quantify. Many tunnel rats returned home with lasting tremors, insomnia, panic attacks. Some never spoke of what they saw down there. Others spoke only in fragments. There were no monuments built for the tunnel rats, no grand ceremonies. Their work was invisible by natured one in places the sun never touched. And maybe that's fitting, because their world was one of shadows and soil, silence and breath. A war inside the war. Today, the tunnels still exist. Many have been widened for tourists, lit with soft bulbs, cleared of danger. But those are just the remnants. The real tunnels, the ones that Matarader buried, sealed off by time, known only to those who once crawled through them with a hand on the wall and a gun in the dark. If napalm was the fire from above, then this was the fear from below. And both spoke to a deeper truth. In Vietnam, the enemy wasn't just out there. He was above you, below you, beside you. And sometimes, he was you. Because in a war without clean lines, even identity could collapse under pressure. The next story is one where that collapse became literal, where uniforms didn't matter, where safety became hazard, where fire came not from the enemy but from your own side. Friendly fire. It's a phrase that almost sounds benign. Friendly fire. Two words that, taken separately, suggest something comforting. But in the crucible of Vietnam, where dense jungle and split-second decisions ruled the battlefield, the term took on a tone as cold as steel. Friendly fire wasn't rare. It was inevitable. A war fought in a place with no clear lines, no high ground, and no consistent uniforms made error not the exception but the rule. Over 0 American service members were killed or wounded by their own forces during the Vietnam War. And that's just the official number. The real figure is unknowable, obscured by confusion, poor record-keeping, and, in some cases, deliberate omission. Because sometimes, no one wanted to admit what had happened not to families, not to superiors, not to themselves. The jungle played its part. Visibility was often measured in feet. One unit moving through the trees could easily be mistaken for the enemy by another. Helicopters flying support missions had to make decisions in seconds, friend or foe, move or wait. In an environment where entire firefights were measured in minutes, mistakes were made quickly, and corrected only afterward, when it was too late. Artillery fire, too, carried its own risks. One digit off in a set of coordinates could shift a shell's impact point by hundreds of meters. In open terrain, such a mistake might be survivable. But in Vietnam's tightly packed foliage, it could mean an entire platoon erased before anyone realized where the shells were falling from. Radio communications helped, but radios failed. Signals crossed. Call signs overlapped. And the enemy listened. Then there were the night patrols. Many units operated in pitch darkness, navigating trails by feel and memory. A sudden noise. A shadow moving in the wrong direction. The flash of a muzzle. And a reflexive burst of gunfire. In those moments, the question of who came second. Reaction came first. Some survivors later described firing on instinct knowing it might be wrong, but fearing hesitation more than guilt. And guilt, when it came, was difficult to shake. For those who pulled the trigger or called the coordinates, the knowledge that they'd killed one of their own rarely settled cleanly. Some carried it in silence, others rationalized, a few never found peace. And for those who survived, the arrow-wounded or bearing witness the betrayal wasn't necessarily in the act, it was in the response. In how quickly the incident was buried. How rarely it was named. Command often did what it could to manage fallout. Investigations were opened, reports filed, words like miscommunication, fog of war, or tragic incident filled the margins. In rare cases, someone was disciplined. More often, it was filed away, another story that didn't fit the narrative. Because admitting that the danger came from within, that the bullets you ducked might not have been from the other side, complicated things. And war, as messy as it already was, didn't always have room for complications. Even civilians were not spared. Airstrikes meant for enemy strongholds sometimes landed on friendly villages. Napalm dropped off course. Gunships mistook a group of retreating allies for insurgents. And from the ground, it all looked the same. Smoke, flame, silence. The aftermath didn't always come with explanation. The psychological damage was more enduring than the physical. Some soldiers developed a deep distrust of support units, or of their own commanders. Jokes about staying out of range of the Zoomies, Air Force pilots, masked real anxiety. In some fire bases, the safest place wasn't behind the lines but farther forward, where at least you knew who was shooting at you. And yet, this wasn't a war of villains. No one aimed to harm their own, but intention meant little to those caught in the crossfire. In Vietnam, where chaos shaped every operation, friendly fire wasn't a malfunction, it was a feature. A consequence of fighting in a place where nothing stood still and everything could be mistaken for something else. Today, the memorials bear no asterisks, no names with footnotes. The wall in Washington, D.C. does not differentiate between those killed by enemy hands or by accident. In war, all deaths are final. All families grieve the same. But in the eyes of those who lived it, who saw friends fall to fire that came from behind, there's a different kind of weight. It's the burden of knowing that even among your own there were no guarantees. No safe direction, no safe decision. And yet, even this was a kind of war they could see, hear, document. But the next terror, that came without notice, without error. It was designed, targeted, and unleashed with the quiet calculation of intelligence. Its mission wasn't to maim or kill, but to disappear.